Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and today I'm gonna make a dragon. So right off the bat, this is my second time trying to make this guy. The first time I got all the way to the first bake before remembering that I live in Scotland, and Scotland is home to teeny tiny ovens. Unfortunately, my teeny tiny oven was too teeny tiny for my Dinraal Mark I, so I had to scrap that original design and go even smaller. Fortunately, something tiny nerdy things, so making a smaller version is pretty on brand for me. This did work in my favor though, since it forced my hand into using some orange and yellow clay, which, when blended together, gave me a pretty convincing body for my molten lava danger noodle. The idea here is that if I make the mythical sky snake out of nothing more than gray clay, I'll have to paint it with a series of bright yellow and orange lava tones before carefully and painfully repainting all the scales and furs with poorly pigmented white paint. But if I make it with colored clay, then I can skip over all the painting nonsense and go straight to the highlighting part, potentially saving myself the slow descent into madness that is painting with oranges, yellows, and whites. It's just a theory at this point, but so is gravity, and I'm fairly confident that if I jump up into the air, I'm gonna come back down rather than drift off into space. Dinraal's belly is mostly slatted scale similar to a snake, which are easy enough to make using a ruler, then adding a little bit of texture with a couple silicone shapers. My plan is to paint these with brick and purple color later, but if I can add enough detail now, then the lava color should show through once I start painting. Again, saving a little time and a lot of tears. Once I've got the scales added along the length of the body, I can drill a few holes to fit the legs. The legs are going to be extra long at this point so that I can use them to balance my danger noodle while I add the scales and the majority of the body detail. I'll blend these into the body using a bit more fresh lava clay, then I can get started with the rocky spikes that adorn Dinraal's spine. I've rolled out a thick wormy dealie of pure grade A yellow clay, which I'll chop into pieces roughly the size of nibs before baking them in the oven. Once they're baked, I can come back through with a knife and chop them up until they are roughly crystalline in shape. These then get glued to the back of our flying magma rope. I'm also going to be covering everything in scales and rocky bits, so I'm not concerned about any of the obvious gaps that are showing at this point. Speaking of scales, this is, them. With the scales added, I can start to add all the little rocky bits that blend the crystal protrusions with the rest of the body before adding what I like to think of as the scale skirt that separates the upper body from the belly. I'll do this by rolling out a nice long wormy dealie and then running it along just below the bottom scales. Then I'll blend it into those scales so it looks like one solid piece. Finally, with the skirt marked out, I can start filling in the shoulders with slightly longer, slightly more Ovaltine scales. I'll also take a bit of time and fill in any of the larger gaps with smaller custom fit scales. Now I know I keep calling them scales, but I'm pretty sure they're just hardened sections of lava that make up the fiery noodle body. Before I make all the tiny hands though, I need to support the body from beneath. I know that I want my airborne magma pasta to be flying, so I'm going to use some acrylic rod to hold it up, since they're halfway sturdy enough to hold something up, but they're also not so transparent as to be noticeable in the end. For the time being though, a couple lengths of wire jammed all up in there will lift everything up while I work on the rest of the dragon. The aforementioned hands will be made of a few lengths of tiny wire covered in black clay, which then gets stuck onto the shortened nubs that I was using as stands before. Originally, I left the fingertips pointy so that I could add the magma claws onto the ends, but I found it was easier to make the claws separately than just glue them on individually, so I ended up clipping the wire and rounding the ends so that the glue had a larger surface area to stick to. Then with everything else finished, I'm ready to get started on the head. Now my plan starting out was to make the head separately and then bake it and glue it onto the unscaled nub, since I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to get the whole thing in the oven. But I forgot that was the plan, and I just started building it right on top. Fortunately, with a little elbow grease, grade 12 geometry, and more than a little anxiety, I managed to fit it in the oven in the end. Now as far as how to make a dragon head, I think the trick here is just to keep adding bits of clay until you've got a slightly bloated looking skeksis. The mouth is also kind of lava-y, so I'll add a thin layer of fire orange clay around the beak and on the bottom of the head before adding some more teeny tiny scales on top. I'll blend the topmost of the scales into the rest of the head and then randomly add more scales around the eyes, on the top of the head, and just kinda everywhere. Finally, to fill in the smooth blank spaces, I'll poke tiny dots using the end of a pen. The plastic wrap around the tip will just keep the dots rounded and soft rather than sharp-edged. Then I can start adding the little tufts of hair that make up Dinraal's neck beard before moving on to its glorious flowing mane. The mane is mainly little blobs of clay that get attached in a row and textured before the next row gets added on top. To add the ears, I've poked some holes just behind the eyes, and I'll stick a couple little lengths of wire in so that I can add the clay over top. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward making little spoons out of clay. In order to make a set of horns that's mirrored, the best way I know is to take two pieces of wire and bend them at the same time. This way I'm left with two identical wires, and I can simply flip one of the wires around to get mirror images. Then these just get glued into the top of the head through some pre-drilled holes, and I can add a couple layers of clay over each of them. The horns are also molten lava, so a yellow base means that I can add some color later. But once I finish smoothing the horns, I can put it in the oven for one final bake, and that's the sculpting finished, which means I'm on to adding details with the paint. I'll start with the belly since I'll need to hold the dragon upside down to reach it. I basically want to change the top color from a lava-y red to a lava-y purple, so to do this I'll mix some terracotta paint with a little matte medium. This should give the paint a little bit of transparency so that when I paint it over the clay, I'll still have some of that base color showing through. Then I'll dry brush the belly with a little bit of purple before adding some darker purple shading along the bottom of the skirt. And then finally afterwards I'll come back through with a light purple dry brush to help make some of the details stand out. My scales are a bit too pristine and I want to dull them down a tiny bit, so I'm going to dry brush everything with a light gray before going over everything again with a bright white. The gray will help to add a little bit of variation in the color of the scales and to help show that each scale is separate, while the white will sharpen the edges and fix some of the spots where I went a bit ham with the gray. To give the crystals and horns a bit of a fiery look, I'm going to add little splotches of bright orange paint. Now I probably could have skipped this step if I'd used a mix of orange and yellow clay, but I wasn't sure that I'd be able to control the coloring as well that way, so I opted to paint everything afterwards. Yellow is also the perfect base for an orange, so painting everything can be done in one coat anyways. The eyes will get repainted with reds and blues later, but a base coat of orange will help with that step. I've also painted the inside of the ears and then add some orange coloring to the base of the tufts of the hair that make up the mane. Finally, for a last bit of variation in the horns and the crystals, I'll add some little blotches of dark red. And the eyeballs get the patented Legend of Zelda monster makeover with red irises, blue pupils, and glorious lashes. Then the absolute final step will be adding a coat of gloss varnish over all the lava bits to give them a nice healthy shine. Now the base. I'd considered a whole bunch of bases but couldn't settle on anything that didn't outshine the dragon, so finally I decided to go uber simple and just make some clouds. It's a flying dragon after all, so let's put it up in the clouds. I've got a leftover acrylic plate that I can drill a couple holes into, then using a little bit of UV resin I can lock the acrylic rods in place. Resin isn't ideal as a glue since it doesn't bond to acrylic very well, but it's all I've got, so it'll do. Now the clouds will be made out of cotton balls that I will hot glue onto the base. And then I'll also paint the bottom of the base blue to give it a bit more of a sky-y vibe, and then all I need to do is pop the dragon onto the rods and hope it doesn't fall apart. And with that, we're on to our Glamour Shots. Wait, it's missing something. A missing link to give it scale. So, why not a tiny link to give it scale? Now this may be the smallest link I've ever made, but that's kind of the point. The dragon is huge, but also small, so link needs to be small, but also really small. Now because he's so wee, I wanted to make sure he's immediately recognizable, so I'm gonna go with the tried, tested, and true blue champion's tunic. I will assure you, however, that the fact that I have the perfect blue clay on hand and I won't have to paint anything plays no part in my decision whatsoever. Now I want to give his glider a tiny bit of a curve, so I'm going to sculpt the fabric on the backside of a spoon. Once I've cut away the right shape, I can use a heat gun to cure the clay enough to at least attach the rest of the parts. I didn't record the other parts because I forgot to press record on the camera. Fortunately, the other parts are little wormy deedlies bent into shape and glued onto the glider. Then I glued the glider onto Link's stubs and gave him tiny hands holding on for dear life. Then I snipped him off his wire and added tiny leather boots onto the bottoms of his pants. Then all that was left to do was paint the final details onto his tunic, give him some of my patent-pending lonk eyes, paint his mobile phone, and then add the rest of the details onto the glider. Finally, I can stick the tiniest piece of wire to Link's back and make a sneaky anchor underneath a scale. And now we're on to the Glamour Shots. And there you have it, folks. 1 dragon down, 2.5 left to go. Why Dinraal? Because I always like the idea of a fiery danger noodle stalking the skies. Besides, if I'm going to make Calamity Ganon one of these days, I don't want to burn out already on evil purple goo. So what do you want to see next? Another beastie? A new location? Let me know down below. Of course, if you're new here, then consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and sharing it with your friends. Or if you want to go that one step further, then consider joining my Patreon. For as little as £1 a month, you can help me make tiny nerdy things just like my newest patrons do. So a big thank you to them: Josh Gill, Madrigal, Go-Go Goose, Still Leaf, Bayonetta 1807, Christian Vincent, Xylo, Michael Stefanik, Jinx Martell, Eleanor Dean, Andrew Fern, and Paul Whitrock. These tiny things take a huge amount of time to make, and it is your support that makes them possible. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.